this Jap dropped this rifle, and I got a hold of it and I gave it to somebody in the Sea Beast. And I said, I want this rifle. This is a rifle that shot me. And when I got home, my wife said, I got a rifle in here, it's supposed to be yours. And I said, no, that was a Jap rifle. And that's the rifle that shot me. And I'm the last guy he shot.
At about the time that Henry Ford invented and implemented the motorized assembly line for his increasingly popular Model T, a significant breed of American citizen began entering the world. As these Americans began their lives, the booming, roaring 20s gave way to economic collapse. The Great Depression was, by any measure, a true test of human survival and perseverance. Americans did survive, and in the process, learned to defeat an adversary in whatever form it presented itself. As the end of that terrible decade of hardship drew near, the smoldering embers of World War I were being stoked by Adolf Hitler and his Nazi regime. Bent on revenge, Hitler blatantly ignored the Versailles Treaty and quickly rearmed Germany for war. Brazened by the lack of response from the Western powers, Germany unleashed a terrifying new type of warfare that combined the technological advances in armor and air power with lightning-fast infantry support. Poland was the first to feel the unimaginable fury of Hitler's blitzkrieg, and in just a few months, the German army accomplished what it could not in over 4 years of bloody stalemate in the First World War. By the summer of 1940, the Nazis swept through all of Scandinavia, Belgium, and France. Finally, only Great Britain stood between Germany and its total domination of Western Europe. While Germany had all of Europe ablaze, the tiny island nation of Japan had burned a trail of death and destruction through Manchuria, China, and across a broad stretch of the South Pacific. Newsreels of the carnage and brutality in the wake of each Axis advance flashed on movie theater screens all across the United States. Still, Americans clung to the faint hope that their country could somehow avoid being swept into the growing global conflict. Then, on a calm Sunday morning on December 7, 1941, the Imperial Japanese Navy launched an unprovoked attack on the United States Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor, killing and wounding thousands of Americans. The surprise attack was a complete success for Japan, but they had grossly underestimated the industrial might and the will of the American people. The sleeping giant was now awake. As details of the attack spread across the nation, initial shock gave way to anger and a cry for swift revenge. This was no longer someone else's fight a world away. An enemy had attacked us on our own soil, killed our people, and challenged us to defend ourselves and our way of life. Now we had a score to settle. The very next day, December 8th, President Roosevelt addressed Congress and the American people, detailing the attack. That same day, Congress declared war on Japan, and America was formally entered in the war. Now, these men and women, and specifically our local veterans who we honor here tonight, who were raised under such hardships and turmoil in which they learned to survive, had a new adversary, one which meant to destroy us, one which would take our country, our home, and our freedom. These Americans would deny their intent at all costs, offering their last full measure of devotion. They would fight, they would survive, they would prevail.
This was the Great Depression. Things were tough people. I was fortunate to be able to go to college, although I worked on the campus, and I worked in one of the stores on 7th Avenue on Saturdays, Montgomery Ward. But it was tough times for people.
After graduation, got a job with Bell Telephone. I wanted to go to college. My dad, who had shared a depression with everyone, said, "Can't do it, we have no money."
I wanted to go to college, and I didn't really have the money to do it. But my history teacher says you can get a job and wait on tables or something like that, and you'll be able to make it.
Where I really got the inspiration for going in, of course, in the questionnaire to ask if people were patriotic, and I think everybody was at that time, and I sure was. And I was on my way to work at Western Electric, and that was down Dundalk, Maryland. And I saw the popular sign, "Uncle Sam wants you," and I got off the bus and went over and signed up for the Waves.
I was a senior in high school in Pearl Harbor, and was pretty shocked about this, of course, as everybody else was.
The way the Japanese attacked us at Pearl Harbor, that made everybody a little bit anxious to get over and knock them out.
I think it was much like probably the whole country. We were anxious of what was going on over in Germany and hoping that we wouldn't get into that. But that just seemed to be something that we weren't going to escape because the way the situation was, you know. And then when Pearl Harbor came about, why, there was no question that we were going to be in. So the tenor of the town, I think, changed then because everybody was worried about their children being drafted. And so it was a tense time.
We had a tremendous anti-war movement going on before we were attacked in Japan, by Japan. We were isolationists, and there was this anti-war movement you see now is nothing new. We had it before World War II. There were people that said we ought to stay the hell out of it. We had the oceans on both sides of us. We were isolated. We don't want any part of it.
Well, I think everybody rose up in anger. I think we felt we've really been abused by the Japanese. They played dirty.
So I went to work for Bell Telephone in Rochester and heard about all the money Curtiss-Wright was paying at the plant that had been built in Beaver, so I went to work at Curtiss-Wright, and I was at Curtiss-Wright until I went to the service. That was February of 1943.
Well, I first started in the milling department, for the milling machines. And then I worked there for a while, and then they took some of us to teach us how to weld. And that's what I ended up doing, welding.
Curtiss-Wright was an interesting place. I remember when I was younger, I watched them build the plant. It was government sponsored, and they were building propellers for airplanes, of course. So I went to work there. I worked there about 6 months before I went to the service. I was an inspector, and it was an interesting plant. It was a huge plant, and we worked 3 shifts round the clock. And when I got in the service, my main interest at the time sort of was in the Air Force was to look for Westinghouse propeller. I'm sorry, not Westinghouse, that was later. To look for Curtiss-Wright propellers, and I did see some of those on the planes.
We weren't prepared. You know, we went up, we meaning the United States, when Pearl Harbor happened, we weren't prepared for anything. We weren't expecting a war.
Our military preparedness was very bad.
We weren't very well prepared for the war. In fact, we weren't prepared at all for the war. Everyone in the country practically had a relative, close relative in the military. I understand the figures are 25% of in World War II, 25% of the population had a son, brother, cousin, aunt, uncle, you name it, in the military.
There was constant concern on the home front about what was going on overseas. Everybody had a brother or a father, or an uncle, a cousin in the armed forces overseas.
In my office over in New Brighton, we have pictures of 75 young men who were killed in the war in the northern end of Beaver County.
But that was going on all over the country. My mother's, they had these little pennants that people had in their windows. Had stars on them for everyone who was in the armed forces. My mother's pennant had 4 stars on it. If there was a gold star, that meant someone had been killed in action. So it was hard at home too.
Almost every house had a banner with blue stars on it. As a matter of fact, if you weren't in the service, you were ostracized. That was the esteem that the people held the military in at that time.
There was not many families that weren't touched by a casualty, or some either close relative, distant relative, or some very close friend, or the neighbor's son, whatever.
Oh, sure, there was always somebody that you knew of. I can't recall, by name, but there was always somebody, for somebody else's joy, there was a sorrow in the family because of either someone that was killed or wounded,
But the people on the home front also made sacrifices. And, there was rationing. They didn't get all the food they wanted. Automobile production stopped. If you had a car, you could drive at 35 miles an hour. If your tires wore out, you got them retreaded if you could find someone with the rubber.
You had 2 types of rationing coupons for food. You had meat rationing coupons and food rationing coupons, heating oil coupons. Farmers received coupons for fuel for their tractors.
People have said that was the good war. No war is good, war is hell, but everybody wanted to do his or her part in that war. Women took jobs that men had to give up. Rosie the Riveter,
But everybody was, it's different then than it is now. Everybody was just for our boys, and that was part of what the Waves did, to release them so that they could do more of not being in the office and be out in the field and doing what they had to do.
It was a great effort.
I was appalled at the cruelty and the actions of Japanese soldiers and officers. They were great fighters, but they were inhumane, if that's a good word.
It took me a long time because They were so cruel, the Japanese. They were so cruel.
Japanese had surrendered officially, but the Japanese soldier, in most cases, wouldn't believe there were surrenders, and they were very difficult to convince.
I was a forward observer with the 4th Marine Division, so I was up on the line with the infantry. And we got as far as Iwo Jima, and here come these Japs right after us. Well, our guys were going to get, we're not moving. We're either going to kill them or they're going to kill us. But we're staying.
So all those guys were captured, and they marched them, took them back to Bataan and marched them up the what was called the Death March, which was really. And it was a very sorry period in our American history, and if there's anybody watching this that doesn't remember Corregidor and Bataan and the Death March, they better go back and reread their history, because that was a terrible, terrible.
On the night that we boarded a ship to go over for the invasion of Samar, being a short distance, we got hit and was sunk. And it happened in the darkness of night, and everyone was scurrying around. I wound up in the sea without life jacket.
Minivet was going one way and we were going the other. And the mines that were cut loose were floating.
We're on the way to Lady Gulf attack, and one of our boilers went down. And so I had to shut the ship off from any engines going to repair that. We were sitting in the middle of that Pacific Ocean with one destroyer going around like this until they got it fixed. And that was the first time that I was a little nervous.
And this one mine somehow got over to the Minivet, and just about the magazine and hit it, and the darn thing exploded. The ship went up and down. I think my book says it's 9 minutes before it went down. And we were the closest ship. So it was our duty to go in and rescue as many as we could.
Occasionally it would be 5, 6 at a time, and it was almost we had 9 invasions. We went into initial invasions. And of those 9s, we always had casualties in Bering Sea.
I was on the ocean 15 months without a break. And, well, if you go through 7 invasions, you know it's going to take time.
And then we see these poor guys. My gun station was back above the sick bay. That was a hospital. I'd see them dragging these men, and the guy named Hammond, he had the incinerator in his stern ship. He would take arms and legs and throw them in there and burn them. And you'd see them bring these guys out of sick bay with a sheet over their face, and then take them to John that would sew them in a canvas. They'd wait till they had 5 or 6 or 7, put a flag over each of them, put them on a board, and put them overboard.
And I happened to end up on the island of Corregidor. I hope people remember Corregidor.
2 of us were sent in alone to be the first to land at Salerno. It was still dark. I think it was the last one they did in darkness. And the enemy you could see their muzzle flashes of their 88s. That's how close they were.
Corregidor was the island out in Manila Bay, fortress really, just opposite the Bataan Peninsula.
And of course, everybody should know what happened to Bataan. The American and Filipino Army fought their way, retreating, of course, with the Japanese pushing them toward the end of the island, the end of the peninsula, and from there, what units could went out into the island of Corregidor, across about 1.5 miles. And Corregidor then was under siege for, I don't know, a year or so, I guess. And conditions were very difficult.
My ship we counted 18 holes, and we were taking on some water after I pulled away, but we were able to get to Palermo to get welded up, and then we came back. It was very precarious beachhead. For days, they didn't know whether we were going to make it or not, but we did. I was carrying British troops in that invasion. A major was in command, a Yorkshireman. They had been in North Africa, hadn't been home for 8 years.
The times when you see the flashes coming out of the gun barrels and you know they're pointed right at you, now that's very terrifying. That is another thought, you know, you see. You don't ever forget that.
In the Bulge, we had a lot of casualties. In a 6-week period, there were 89,000 casualties. 19,000 were dead. And Graves registration piled these guys up. Just rows of them, stacked up. And when you went by them, it was really a sight to behold. We didn't it's indescribable.
And I can remember a Marine, they were interviewing him here not too long ago on TV, and he told how it feels to see bullets coming right at you, and you know, and I said, there's the first guy I ever heard really describe what it's like. You get this sour, salty, dry taste in your mouth. And I said, man, that guy hit it right on the head.
Allocated 32 cents a day to feed them. But when you have a bunch of people, you can make out on that. So whenever we had troops, we'd save enough in our budget that when they came aboard, we could really feed them. I mean, it was top grade. It was none of that cheap stuff you had. I mean, we tried our, because we realized that what these men were doing.
Our base was right on what they called Buzz Bomb Alley. The V-2 rockets would come over at about 500 feet at night. And they had a real loud thumping bass type jet engine on them. And it would light up the sky, and it had this big flame come out the back. And there's no pilots in them.
I heard this rocket coming over, and you could hear them. And sometimes when they came over, the engine would cut out, and when the engine cut out, it fell straight down. Other times it would glide a little bit. Well, I heard this rocket, and I thought, gee, that sounds very close. And somebody was out in the polo field, yelled, it's going to fall right on the college. And I thought, what am I going to do now? So I ran outside, and I ran out onto this balcony, and I looked, and there it was. And the engine cut out, and I didn't know what to do. I thought, well, I'm never going to make it down the steps and over to the field, or in this polo field. So I ran back in, ran under a desk, and the thing hit. And it hit right at the end of the polo field. It broke every window downstairs and didn't touch the upstairs at all.
And we stopped at a camp called Lucky Strike. It had several, now we're replacements, you understand, going into join a division. Camps were called after cigarette names. The ones we happened to stay in was Camp Lucky Strike, And any of the veterans from Europe, remember those cigarette camps?
But yes, we did train. We went out into the channel and would beach and land troops to get everybody familiar with the drill. There was one large rehearsal that was to simulate the actual landing. At the end, this was at the end of April of 1944.
I did one time, chasing an FW-190, get in such a steep dive, go so fast, when I pulled out, I blacked out considerably, and I didn't even know it. And when the curtain went up on the blackout, when I could see again, the airplane was in front of me. I shot it down, and then I latched onto another 190, and I shot it down, and I didn't know it, and I looked out, and my wings were bent because I pulled out of the dive so fast. And one of the North American aviation engineers said you had to be doing 600 miles an hour to do that. And this is in a 400-mile-an-hour airplane, you know.
And during the night, German E-boats came. There's a difference of opinion about how many, 3 or 6, and they sank LSTs. They went up through between 2 columns of LSTs and sank 2 and damaged another, and it was a fiasco. The rehearsal was a disaster. We lost nearly 1,000 personnel in that operation.
On D-Day, which was June 6, 1944, we had been transferred down to Southampton, England, and I was out in the middle of the night, and I heard the roar of all these planes going overhead. In fact, the sky was blackened with planes. They were going over to bomb the beaches in France prior to D-Day invasion.
I remember on D-Day, the night before they striped the planes, they put black and white stripes on the wings. It seemed like a beautiful day where we were, and seeing the planes come back, all the planes coming overhead, going to various places, I guess, and you would see where there'd be 1 missing from the flight or 2 missing from the flight. They'd be dropping flares to let them know they had wounded aboard and so on. I remember that very vividly.
This was a 60-mile front. And so we arrived off the beach at midnight and watched the aerial bombardment, the anti-aircraft fire, which was nothing like I ever saw before or since, all night. And then shortly before HR, which was 5:30, the commander told me to get underway and proceed toward the beach.
And of course, D+3, there was still a lot of the rough parts of the invasion still there. And as we climbed up on the beach, I noticed a boot laying there, and I looked down and there was a leg in it, which was kind of scary because I'd never seen anything quite like that. It really was something I won't forget.
I was out about every night, someplace or another. Right near where we were was a little community that they had a few stores and a few pubs, and you'd go over to the pub and you would play darts, and I didn't like the English beer because it was warm, but the people were very friendly. And you go, you had a lot of plays to go to, you had a lot of movies to go to.
It was like nothing you'd ever expect. All of a sudden, everybody forgot there was war going on, and they were just as happy as they could be just to see all these people from America come in here and put on a show for them. I think Betty Hutton was one of them.
Well, I had a girlfriend in England. Her name was Joyce, and I went to the dance. In fact, one of the things I brought was a dance ticket that I'd received, and it was dated December 18th, 1943 or 4, I forget which December 18th has to be my birthday. But I took her to this dance, and then I'd walk her home, and then I'd have to walk back to camp. And I used to see her quite often, but of course, when you leave, and that's the end of that.
Well, I had a lot of fun in Paris.
We did a lot of boozing, I'll tell you. And when you got 3 days off, you went in town and whooped it up as much as you could, you know.
They took all the cigarettes and the chocolates and everything, and they rolled them up and gave us something to bargain with when we got to Paris. So the Jeep driver and I had quite a time. If you imagine 2 young fellas in Paris with the bedrolls full of candy bars, and I'll leave the rest up to your imagination.
There's always one airplane we liked to hear coming, because we knew PBY usually brought the mail. I don't know, it didn't seem that bad.
But, it was really ironic because you stand on that ship, and of course it's going like this, and the moon's shining, clear blue sky, and at night, and it's just so beautiful. You think, how could there be a war in this? But there was. Didn't know whether the sub was out there or whether it wasn't.
We were pretty desperate for something to eat. And right beside where we were was a ration depot. And there was a guard in there walking around and says, "Hey, how about throwing us one of those cans of ham that you got there?" And we could see what was in there close enough we could read the labels on it. He says, "I can't do that." I said, "Well, how long does it take you to walk your line?" He said, "Oh, about 15 minutes. He says, "I'm going to be leaving now." So he got out of sight, and we were over the fence with barbed wire on the top. Got what we wanted and threw it back over. By the time he got back, we had a hole dug, poured the gasoline in it, was cooking the meat. And by the time so we says, "Just stay there a little while and we'll give you something to eat."
I choose to remember the fun parts and choose to forget the bad parts.
The beach that we're going to land on now looks to be very hot from here. We can't see it too well from our position here on this side of the superstructure, but we can see those geysers from bursting mortar shells and artillery shells being tossed up in the air. And also the land just beyond the water, just inland of the beach itself.
And Iwo Jima was about 8 square miles of real estate. We were to be on and off Iwo Jima in 3 days and go on to Okinawa. Well, we were there for 30-some days. And I got hit twice there, and they took me down and put me on a hospital ship.
And when the Battle of the Bulge broke out, we were heading for Saint Nazaire in France, where there was a pocket of about 100,000 German soldiers, and they were completely surrounded. The only exit they had was by sea.
We got to Liège, Belgium in December of '44, and the Battle of Bulge began.
They lost so many men in the Battle of the Bulge and that sort of thing that it's just amazing that we survived, you know.
Unfortunately, the Americans didn't have enough troops there. Patton's Third Army was well south. They were quite a ways from where the Battle of the Bulge was occurring. It was Hitler's last effort to try to do something to get us back out of Europe. Their goal was to get to Antwerp, which of course they never did. That was a big port there, bringing in supplies. But the United States decided that they needed more people. So what they decided they would do, they were going to take cooks and clerks and ground people, everything, and stick them into the infantry to go and fight the Germans in the Bulge areas. That's the Ardennes Forest.
I really didn't give a damn. We were of a mind that I wasn't coming back.
Now, these guys are in there with families. You know, they got something else on their mind. You can see, when you get in a combat situation, you might as well consider yourself dead, you know, that you're not coming back.
And our commanding officer and battalion commander were standing there, and they stopped us. They said, "There's something going on in that field over there. Why don't you go find out what it is?" It was a huge pillbox, huge. And there were 3 German soldiers came out of it, and they had their hands up and they were waving a white sheet. They wanted to surrender. And all at once we heard a machine gun open fire, and they were dead. They shot them. It turned out there was an SS trooper in that pillbox, and he shot them because they wanted to surrender. And I stuck my head up to see what was going on. I got shot right through the helmet. Machine gun bullet right through here. Felt like somebody hit me on the head with a sledgehammer.
This foxhole that I was assigned to was right out on the peak of a hill, and there's a big valley down below. And I stayed there for 3 months.
It was also the site near there of one of the really bad parts of World War II, and that was the Buchenwald concentration camp. Eisenhower had told the commanders of the various groups, squadrons, and so on, that he wanted every soldier in Europe to visit a concentration camp to see what it really was like, what really had happened. So they took us to Buchenwald, which was notorious for lots of reasons, not the least of which was the fact that the commandant's wife wanted all the prisoners who had tattoos to be killed and skinned so they could make lampshades out of their tattooed skin. That's what she did.
The prisoners were in very bad shape. They were not in any position to be freed. They were decimated, not decimated, they were incapacitated, basically. They were skin and bones, skeletons. There were some, I hesitate to even talk about it, but there were bodies hanging on meat hooks. It was a horrible sight. It's the most, it's enough to give you nightmares regularly.
So I got to see a lot of stacks of clothing from the inmates that had been put to death. I saw the gas chambers where they'd been gassed. There were some of the inmates still walking around. In fact, one of the pictures I brought shows one of them sitting there he was practically skin and bones.
We captured the city of Kaiserslautern, including a labor camp, which is like a concentration camp. Saddest thing I ever saw. It was terrible. People were emaciated. They didn't get enough food. They didn't have anything that belonged to them except the rags that they had on their clothes. They wanted to know if they could take anything with them when they left. We just turned them loose and told them to go ahead and go. And they were carrying overstuffed chairs and desks and dining room tables and anything they could get hold of. Where are you going with that? We're going to take it back to Russia, back home.
And of course, the major thing that they told us is don't give them water, don't give them food, don't even touch them. And then the medics come in and start treating them. Food would have killed them. Water would have killed them. That was pretty bad sight.
Our military people were giving us some real scary estimates, but they felt as though the invasion of Japan, keep in mind we had taken Iwo Jima and Okinawa at the tremendous loss of life, and the Japanese were digging in, and the military people were estimating that we might lose 1 million people invading Japan. We knew nothing about the atom bomb.
We got down to 1, 0, and right at the bottom of 0, at least by the count, the 29 that was flying overhead carrying the atomic bomb had dropped it and it detonated.
But I've never heard one single veteran ever criticize them for the use of it. It saved probably 800,000 GIs' lives. And everybody felt, hey, you got Pearl Harbor, we got Okinawa. TS, baby.
And as a result, we could feel, I would call it secondary shock waves.
When we heard that the bomb dropped before the war ended, when we heard the bomb drop, everybody was commenting on that, and I says, let me tell you something. We're on our way home starting right now.
I don't believe that the Japanese population, even though they survived, and those that survived Nagasaki and Hiroshima, had any questions or wondered why we dropped the bomb.
Well, it sure affects you. You wouldn't give anything for the experience after you're home and alive, but it's really hell.
Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy.
A bulletin, London. A naval officer just returned to Supreme Allied Headquarters from the French invasion beaches reports that all main points have been gained and that reinforcements are pouring across the channel.
Amtrak are turning back and forth with their loads of marines, and we can see one. It looks like a tank burning in there on the shore.
The Allies are across the Rhine. Troops under General Hodges established a bridgehead on the east bank, south of Bonn, yesterday afternoon.
The German radio has just announced that Hitler is dead.
Tokyo Radio said today that an imperial message accepting the Potsdam Proclamation would be forthcoming soon.
No matter how long it may take us to overcome this premeditated invasion, the American people in their righteous might will win through to absolute victory.
There was celebration practically to the hysteria. In the streets, celebrations, people went wild. And it was such a relief for folks that had boys and relatives, fathers, sons, husbands in the service to think, hey, we survived because there were so many people that did.
The greatest, the wildest celebration of them all was in New York's Times Square. Never before or since has there been a crowd like this on the Great White Way. 2 million people screamed their elation at the end of the most devastating war in recorded history. For 24 hours, the celebration went on, and not for a minute did it lag. Victory had come. Old Glory waved over a happy land.
I just remember we went up to, on VJ Day, we pushed the buggy up street, and it was a wild time. And that was, yeah, it was happy.
I was in that Army hospital in England when the war in Europe was over, and I happened to be home on leave when the war in Japan was over, and I remember all the excitement and everything. It was wonderful.
I trained under the GI Bill to be a monumental engraver. He recommended I go over to Westinghouse Electric, and so I went over there and I got a full-time job over there.
I had already begun my book, Bright Star. The book itself begins with an account, an eyewitness account of the invasion of Normandy. And then I took over the presidency of the family company, Moultrie Steel, in Beaver Falls.
As I say, I wouldn't have missed it for the world.
The only thing that I'd say is that I think it was amazing they were able to assemble 14 million men over the period of the war, equip them and train them, and did as well as they did. I mean, I think that is quite a feat.
But I enjoyed those times. There was a lot of sad things that happened, a lot of funny things that happened, a lot of good things that happened. And I said, I wouldn't take $1 million for my experience, and I wouldn't do it again for that either. So.
But Hugh was never bitter about the 4.5 years he had to give up. He never felt that it did take those years away when he would have been at his prime, you know.
When we came back, we never talked to people about any of the things that happened. We'd just talk to each other once in a while.
We never talk about that.
When I came home, when you spend 4 years with nothing but men, you get the mentality that everything is men's life, you know. I mean, you do things. We always thought the civilians were crazy, and we were the same ones, because we were together so long that we had this bond that you're almost one person. And when I was discharged, it was like I didn't know what to do, because they told you when to go to bed, when to get up, when to eat, what job you were to do. And it's like throwing you out into the wild, you know. No one to tell you what to do.
You have to realize the airplanes that I shot down, there was a person in each one of those. And somebody's mama, you know, had to be unhappy over their son or brother or something like that. And that disturbs me.
My dad was, he said he was afraid after I came home.
And I sort of turned to alcohol. And finally my wife told me, Fred, there's one of two choices. Either you give it up or you give up your family. I was smart enough, I gave it up.
I sent guns and stuff home. And had them under my bed.
For years, she told me I'd lay in bed and just holler and scream, and it took years to get over it.
He was almost to the point he was afraid to go to sleep. He was afraid of what I might do. You know, if I went berserk or whatever.
I hate people to forget men after the war is over so long, because it's a long, long period. Before you come what you call normal. My one regret or concern that I've seen so much carnage that nothing bothers me. Death has no fear.
We're just common, ordinary guys, and they fought like hell.
He says, we're going to do the best we can. And he operated on me, and I said to him when he was finished, how long do you think I have? And he said, well, I think you might live till you're 40. I'm 85. So I beat him.
And I look back on my life, I think, you know, a lot of other people have it a lot. You look at your problems, you say, man, there's a lot of other people got things worse than you do out there. And I feel very, very blessed with my life, you know, with my kid. I got 3 pretty decent kids, you know.
I'm here, the good Lord took care of me. I have my health, my family, I'm happy. What more could I ask for?
I think the good Lord brought me through this because He knew where I was going to go eventually, and I know where I'm going now. When I leave this earth, I've made my peace, and I feel satisfied with that, you know.
But in that particular town in France, The French people were funny because they would keep 3 flags in their attic: the American flag, a German flag, and a French flag, depending on who was in charge at the time. That's the one they hung out the window.
I remember the first day we landed in the infantry, and they served us wieners and beans, and the wieners were as green as grass. Oh, it was just awful.
Edie came out to meet me, and while I was there, her aunt had written to this program called Bride and Groom, and we were married on that program on May the 6th, 1946.
So I'm in the bridge of my ship. Engines are warm, and we're wedged in, so a tugboat comes alongside to pull me out. So the tugboat captain is about level with me in his con, and he pulls me out, and he says, "Well, now you're on your own, Sonny."
He got his Bronze Star, but he always said he got it because he got it for cutting down palm trees and making baseball fields for the team.
See, he was 19 when he went in, and he was promoted to a captain at 21 and a major at 23 and a fighter pilot commander or fighter squadron commander at 24.
At the time, cigarettes were used like currency. I didn't pay any scrip, which was the American money. I didn't use any of that to get her a kimono. I used cigarettes. I don't smoke. And I got a cigarette light ration just like everybody else. I was a popular guy. The guys that didn't smoke were real popular because the other guys wanted your cigarettes. Well, I just saved some of mine and got her a kimono with them.
One sailor came off that ship to my ship carrying a typewriter. Why he wanted to save a typewriter, nobody ever knew. I still don't know. But I still have that typewriter. I wrote my novel, Bright Star, on that typewriter. It was an L.C. Smith manual typewriter.
I was married. I didn't want to go to the Pacific and leave my wife running loose. She was too pretty. So they had what they called barrage balloons, and they had put the barrage balloons up around the cities, you know, to keep the enemy aircraft from coming in. And they said if they ever cut them barrage balloons loose, the island would sink because of all the American equipment that was on it. I mean, we were everywhere.
The last day of my rotational furlough in Sharon, Harry Truman came on the public address system and announced the cessation of hostilities. And I was headed back to Fort Benning, Georgia, where our division was going to reconvene to train, and we found out later we were going to be in the third wave Japan invasion. So Harry was my patron saint. He saved my life. My daughter reminds me that it saved hers too.
Yeah.